Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us and happy Friday. My name is Robert. Let's go ahead and get started. This is Moments in Black History on the Potomac River tour with Captain Bill Washington. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. Everyone will be in listen only mode or muted except for myself and Bill. If you have any questions or comments throughout our presentation tonight, feel free to type those in the Q&A or the chat section. If the screen display is not showing Bill's slides in like a full view, if it's not taking up the full screen and you want that to happen, you can look for something called view or view options, and that should take care of that. The settings on there. We did a sound test earlier and everything seems to be working fine. So if you want to raise or lower the sound on your session, you can check the settings locally on your own device. And so I met Bill at the end of last year. He's a sea captain with tons of experience sailing around the Potomac River and various other nautical places. And he does this really amazing tour of the Potomac River area, focusing on Black history. Now, I kind of consider this program like a preview for the in-person cruise that Bill is going to host us for once the COVID situation ends. And I've told Bill that I'm going to be the first person to sign up when that happens. So when we've had a lot of these online presentations, they're not really like a substitute. They're kind of almost like a get prepared for type of thing. So I kind of consider this like the appetizer before the main course. So Bill's talk tonight will be an appetizer, and then at some point in time in the near future, COVID will end or be under control, and we can go jump on his boat and go check all this stuff out in person. So with that, I'm just really excited to have Bill come back. He gave a presentation similar a couple months ago, and he has just a ton of knowledge and enthusiasm and just a great guy. And so I'm looking forward to hearing from him. So with that, I will turn things over to Captain Bill Washington, and Bill, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Robert, and good evening, everyone. I am Bill Washington. Some of the things, if you've seen this before, I've added a couple of new items I think you'll find interesting. I'll be your captain today, and the presentation you're about to see was originally designed to be conducted live, as Robert said, on a moving vessel on the Potomac River. The original tour took 3 hours, but that allowed for us moving between sites that will be presented today.
Bill, I just realized something. I forgot to ask my two poll questions. So why don't we, if you don't mind, let me do that real quick.
No problem.
This will take like 60 seconds. So if you're joining us, Bill and I were just curious to know where people are connecting from. So let me launch this question and you can let us know, are you in the DC metro area or are you outside the DC metro area? Either one obviously is fine, but just curious to know where people are from today. So I'll leave that open for just a few seconds and share the results with you. And if you're watching on like say Facebook, you can type that in the comments if you so choose. So let's see. So we have so far an even 50-50 split.
Wow.
Let's see. So I'll go ahead and share the results. So yeah, well, actually the outside Washington DC at the last minute kind of pushed ahead. It was a photo finish. It was running 50-50 the whole time. So a little bit more people outside of Washington DC. So that's really cool. Let me stop sharing that. And we also have one more question, if you wouldn't mind. So Bill and I are curious to know, have you ever been out on a boat on the Potomac River? So let us know, yes, of course, or no, not yet, because there are no real no answers. It's always no, not yet. So we'll see how things go. And again, I'll be happy to share the results with you once we're finished. So this one also is running neck and neck. Let's see. Okay, I think that's good enough. So I'll share the results. So this one kind of similar, 49% for the first option and 51%. So maybe that means this could mean one of two things. This either means that 100% of the people that live in Washington, D.C. that are on this call have been on a cruise in the Potomac River, or people that aren't here, living here, have gone on it at some point in time, like in their travels or their visits here. So that's really cool. Let me stop sharing the results. So I closed out the poll. If the questions still pop up on your screen, you can minimize it, exit out, or drag it down to the bottom of the screen. So, okay, wanted to make sure we got that out of the way. So that's interesting. So Bill, sorry to interrupt you, but take it away, all yours again.
Okay, let me close that and get back here. Okay. This first picture is me at the office. She is called the Nightingale. And this is a full view of the Nightingale. It's our vessel for today, so let's get started. The Chesapeake Bay region, which includes the Potomac River, is a significant setting in African American history. This region was a gateway for the first Blacks brought from Africa to the colonies. Throughout the mid-1800s, the bay and its rivers were important routes along the Underground Railroad. After the war, newly emancipated Blacks found their way to the Chesapeake shores, where they literally built the region's economy and shaped its culture. This map shows the slave routes, also known as the Middle Passage, from the African continent to points all along the eastern seaboard of the Americas. The region I will be concentrating on is the Chesapeake region. Slavery in the Chesapeake region began in 1619, when a Dutch trading ship carrying 20 African men entered Jamestown, Virginia. The slave trade expanded enormously in the following years. Between 1619 and 1700, the slave population grew to 13,000. Between 1700 and 1770, the region's slave population expanded to 250,000. By the beginning of the Revolutionary War, 5 years later in 1775, Blacks made up nearly 1/3 of the region's total population. In the 1800s, the Chesapeake region became a focal point of the national controversy surrounding slavery because it was in the unique position of spanning what became known as free, border, and slave states. Free states did not support slavery and made up the northern portion of the region. Slave states encompassed the southern portion of the region. Border states allowed slavery, but were allied with the free states, further complicating the region's politics and causing great turmoil throughout the 19th century. Washington, D.C. was part of the border states, with Alexandria, Virginia, being the northernmost depot of the slave trade. The Underground Railroad, which operated prior to the Civil War between 1830 and 1860, was a coordinated network of slave houses aided by free Blacks and sympathetic whites. Slaves traveled under the cover of darkness along the Underground Railroad to reach freedom. Although it is difficult to pinpoint the exact routes that escaped slaves followed, records show the Chesapeake region and its rivers were often used as passageways to the free North. The Chesapeake segment of the Underground Railroad was an integral part of the anti-slavery movement. To this end, Chesapeake waterways were used in a variety of ways. Escaping slaves would quietly slip aboard docked vessels, which would shuttle them up to the bay and into the Susquehanna River. Captains in Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia hid runaways aboard their ships, risking high fines and jail time. Slaves working on boats also aided runaways by secretly smuggling them on board. Slaves heading from Virginia towards freedom crossed shallow sections of the Potomac River on horseback or wagon to reach safe houses on the Maryland side. The Chesapeake region was increasingly divided over slavery. Pennsylvania, a free state, was loyal to the Union. The border states of Maryland and Delaware were pro-slavery, but also remained loyal to the Union. Virginia seceded from the Union in 1861 to join the Confederacy. When the Civil War started in 1861, the Chesapeake region became a divided battlefield, and slaves seized the opportunity to escape. They often didn't have to travel far to find freedom and assistance with avoiding capture. In Newport News, Virginia, Union Major General Benjamin F. Butler invoked property laws to protect escaped slaves that fled to his camp. He figured that if the Confederacy was going to refer to slaves as property, he could seize them as contraband of war. Butler's interpretation of the law created new hope and a new workforce. Runaway slaves flooded into Union camps where they were put to work. Although they were not fighting on front lines, blacks were instrumental in wartime operations, such as building forts, maintaining railroads, and mining coal. As time passed and Union casualties grew, blacks were granted the right to serve in the Union Army. Many fought in battles throughout the Bay watershed. In Maryland, 6 black regiments were formed, totaling more than 8,700 men. These regiments played major roles in the Union battle plans. The 36th U.S. Colored Infantry guarded the Confederate prison at Point Lookout, Maryland. Later in the war, the infantry disabled Confederate torpedoes in the lower Chesapeake. More than 180,000 black men served in the Union Army and 18,000 in the Union Navy. 21 were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest military honor in the U.S. The ones that are shown here are William Carney. He was the first black man to receive the medal. In 1863, at 23 years old, Carney and 45 other volunteers joined a Union Massachusetts militia called the Morgan Guards, which later became Company C of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. Except for officers and senior non-commissioned officers, the Union was an all-black corps. During the nighttime Battle of Fort Wagner on Morris Island, South Carolina, as the 54th Massachusetts assaulted the fort guarding the entrance of the Charleston, their troops' flag bearer was hit by musket fire and a barrage of cannon shrapnel and dropped the flag. The flag's colors shall never touch the ground, so Carney dropped his rifle, charged at full-out sprint, grasped the flag, and continued onward despite being completely surrounded. He then hurled himself against the low protective wall of the fort. He later wrote, "The bullet I now carry in my body came whizzing like a mosquito, and I was shot. Not being prostrated by the shot, I continued my course, yet had not gone far before I was struck by a second shot." Thomas Hawkins. Private Thomas R. Hawkins and First Sergeant Alexander Kelly served in the same unit, the 6th USC Infantry, and performed similar actions during different battles. Hawkins' Medal of Honor citation from July 21st, 1864 reads, "Rescue of regimental colors. No further details are known other than he participated alongside 4 black regiments at the Battle of Deep Bottom in one of the bloodiest battles in Virginia." General David B. Birney later said, "It was one of the most stirring and gallant affairs I have ever known." James Harris. Sergeant James H. Harris served in the 38th U.S. CT Regiment during the Battle of Chaffin's Farm on September 29th, 1864. He became one of the first enlisted soldiers to enter Fort Harrison in Richmond, Virginia. Christian Fleetwood. Sergeant Major Christian Fleetwood grew up in Baltimore as a free African American and helped to bring the first black-owned newspaper to South Carolina. When he entered service, he rose in rank as an NCO. During the Battle of New Market Heights, also known as the Battle of Chaffin's Farm, on September 29th, 1864, Fleetwood charged with the 6th at daylight and got used up to save the colors. He described it as a deadly hailstorm of bullets sweeping men down as hailstones sweep the leaves from the trees. James Gardner. Private James Daniel Gardner served during the same battle as Christian Fleetwood and was awarded for his actions on September 29th, 1864. According to Gardner's citation, he rushed in advance of his brigade, shot a rebel officer who was on the parapet rallying his men, and then ran him through with his bayonet. Alexander Kelly. First Sergeant Alexander Kelly and Private Thomas R. Hawkins served in the same unit, the 6th USC Infantry, and performed similar actions during different battles. 23-year-old First Sergeant Alexander Kelly, who stood 5 feet 3.5 inches tall, gallantly seized the colors which had fallen near the enemy's line of abatis, raised them and rallied the men at a time of confusion and in a place of the greatest danger. Kelly was one of 14 Black Medal of Honor recipients during the distinction during the Battle of Chaffin's Farms at Newmarket Heights on September 29, 1864. Andrew Jackson Smith. Corporal Andrew Jackson Smith did not receive his Medal of Honor until January 16, 2001, nearly 137 years after his heroic actions at the Battle of Honey Hill in South Carolina. He was a runaway slave before he chose to enlist in the 55th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. On November 30th, 1864, assisted by the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, Smith was caught in the crossfire as Confederate troops fired upon them in an open swamp. The flag bearer of the 55th was killed as Smith swooped in to retrieve the regimental colors and inspired his troops to press on. He was nominated for the Medal of Honor in 1916, but poor documentation resulted in a delay before it was properly reviewed and awarded. John Lawson. After a Confederate shell hit the USS Hartford, 4 of a 6-man gun crew were killed. Lawson was knocked unconscious and another man died beside him. Lawson regained his wits and assumed his duties at the reloading station. He got the guns back into action despite several broken ribs. Powhatan Beatty. On September 29, 1864, at the Battle of Chaffin's Farms, the Confederates eliminated several of Beatty's men, including the flag bearer, as they retreated. Morale was low because all military officers were killed or wounded during the chaos. Beatty emboldened his troops by charging 600 yards through a hail of gunfire and explosions to recover the flag, and took command of his regiment. After participating in 13 battles during the American Civil War, Beatty became a successful actor and playwright. In a little-known yet significant event in Black history, the Pearl Incident unfolded right along the Washington, D.C. waterfront. It was history's largest single attempt at escape from American slavery. In 1848, the nation's capital was still very much a slaveholding jurisdiction. America's influence as a world power and purveyor of worldwide liberty was growing, yet her seat of government did big business in Black bodies. Oddly enough, Washington was only 2 days' journey to the free state of New Jersey, but starkly distant in its practice and acceptance of slavery. Enslaved persons had no rights. Even freedmen had no legal rights. They could not gather in groups of more than 7, had to carry their papers, follow a curfew, and were in constant danger of re-enslavement. The Black organizers of this unthinkable undertaking were Paul Jennings, a butler in the home of a U.S. senator from a New England state, Daniel Bell, a freedman who had grown weary of the court battles in his ongoing attempt to free his slave wife and daughter, and Samuel Edmondson. Late in the evening of Saturday, April 15, 1848, 77 passengers bound for freedom made their way through the darkened and muddy streets of the unfinished federal city. Samuel Edmondson got his sisters, Mary and Emily, out of 2 of Washington's most well-to-do homes, and the 3 navigated the gloom of the capital on their way to the rendezvous point at 7th Street Wharf. These slaves belonged to 41 of the most prominent families in Washington and Georgetown and were valued at $100,000. What was to come in many quiet and subtle ways would change the course of American history. The ship set sail that evening. The Pearl's captain and owner was Edward Sayers, who had been secured for the mission by Daniel Drayton of Philadelphia. Although Drayton was to remember that although he was paid $100, he believed in the nobility of the cause of freedom. The Pearl and her 77 passengers, male and female, young and old, set out full of hope as they aimed for their destination in New Jersey, a 2-day trip by river and bay. Once past Alexandria, Virginia, the schooner began to make good time under fully open sails, and freedom seemed closer than ever. But suddenly a storm came up just past Point Lookout, Maryland, and blocked the entry to the Chesapeake Bay. The ship had to pull in at Cornfield Harbor, Maryland, about halfway to freedom to try and wait it out. Things then went from bad to worse. As wealthy white Washingtonians woke up the next morning to cold stoves, undone chores, empty skillets, and vacant quarters, panic and alarm spread quickly throughout the city. Whites put together a posse which only grew larger as the scope of the escape gradually dawned on them. The pursuers fanned out towards rural towpaths that wound throughout the Maryland woods towards Pennsylvania, not thinking that the ambitious undertaking could have been mounted by boat. While searching, they ran across a gentleman by the name of Judson Diggs. He was a cab driver, an opportunistic free African American who had taken one of the escapees to the 7th Street wharf to catch the Pearl. The passenger had forgotten his fare, which made Diggs angry. But what really made him share damaging information with the whites was that he was turned down by young Emily Edmondson after he proposed to her, and knowing she and her family were aboard the Pearl. The slave masters hurriedly pressed into service a steamboat called the Salem, owned by the wealthy Dodge family whose tobacco warehouses stand to this day at the foot of Georgetown's Wisconsin Avenue. They loaded it with law enforcement personnel and undeputized civilians that took out in hot pursuit of the Pearl. It must be noted that the Dodgers, along with former First Lady Dolly Madison and Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, were reportedly owners of some of the enslaved Africans and their descendants aboard the Pearl. They were about to give up the chase and return empty-handed to a stunned Washington when around 2 a.m. Tuesday morning, April 18th, they happened upon the Pearl docked at Cornfield Harbor. The whites forced their way aboard and without much incident captured the ship and all who were on board. Both ships immediately returned to Washington, with the male slaves manacled and placed on deck for crowds of angry whites to ridicule as the boat slowly passed the piers of the slave port of Alexandria, Virginia. When they reached Washington, the male slaves were sold as punishment, mostly to the deep South states of Georgia and Louisiana. The Pearl incident, as it came to be known, was the fuse that led to an explosion of deeply felt sentiments on both sides of the slavery question. It perhaps tipped the tide in favor of the abolitionists when the world became aware of the travesty of human bondage on the streets, in the institutions, and in the homes of the capital city that styled itself as the cradle of liberty, justice, and equality for all mankind. Now, the last time I did this, somebody asked about what happened to the Edmondson sisters. Well, although the effort failed, the Edmondson sisters were freed from slavery by funds raised by the Congregational Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, New York, whose pastor was Henry Ward Beecher, a prominent abolitionist. After gaining freedom, the Edmondsons were supported to go to school and to work. They campaigned with Beecher throughout the North for the end of slavery in the United States. In 1853, the Edmondson sisters attended the Young Ladies Preparatory School at Oberlin College, Ohio, through the support of Beecher and his sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Since its founding in the 1830s, the school had admitted blacks as well as whites, and was a center of abolitionist activism. However, 6 months after arriving at Oberlin, Mary Edmondson died of tuberculosis. That same year, Stowe included part of the Edmondson's sisters' history with other factual accounts of slavery experiences in A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now it's time for us to move on to our next point of interest, Geesboro Point. Geesboro Point, once known as Geesboro Cavalry Depot, is now occupied by the Department of Defense's Joint Base Anacostia Bowling. However, nearly 150 years ago, during the Civil War, this parcel of land was not a military headquarters, but the logistics hub of the Union Army's cavalry in the Eastern Theater. By providing a ready supply of horses to the Army of the Potomac, the Geesboro Cavalry Depot made an important contribution as the Army fought battles of Virginia. Over 200,000 horses were received, issued, died, or sold at Geesboro during the war. I am mentioning this tract of land because on the eve of the Civil War, the 624-acre Geesboro tract was owned by George Washington Young, who had the dubious distinction of being the district's largest slave owner. In 1862, when the federal government instituted compensated emancipation in D.C., Young received $17,771.85 for the release of the men, women, and children he held in servitude. That is equal to over $400,000 in today's dollar. The Geesboro Manor Plantation, whose primary product had been tobacco, dated back to the colonial period of 1680. It's time to move on to our next destination, the Anacostia region. Captain John Smith, one of the founders of Jamestown, Virginia, was the first European explorer to reach the Anacostia area. Better known for his reported rescue from death by the Indian maiden Pocahontas, Smith made several voyages of exploration along the Chesapeake Bay after the establishment of the first English colony in the New World in 1607. Excuse me. During his explorations of the Chesapeake Bay region, Captain Smith sailed up the Potomac River, reaching the Eastern Branch, later named the Anacostia River, on June 16, 1608. Landing on the southern banks of the Eastern Branch, his party entered the village of the Nacotchtanks, the original Anacostians. From the site of present-day Anacostia and following the Trail of Fair Justice, now known as Good Hope Road, Captain Smith traveled east from the river to the camp of the indigenous people. His arrival in the region triggered a chain of events that eventually led to their relocation. This particular site had been occupied continuously for over 3,000 years before John Smith's arrival in 1608. The Nacotchtanks were members of a tribal subdivision of the Algonquins. They lived in domed-roofed houses made of bent poles covered with branches and skins. The village was ideally located because the climate was mild, the forests were lush and green, wildlife was plentiful, and, at the time, the crystal clear rivers were filled with fish. Because of its geographic location, the village thrived as an active trading center. The Iroquois, from as far away as what is now New York State, traveled here yearly to barter and trade. As its fame spread, English merchants recognized it as the most important trading village in the entire Tidewater area. Sadly, the original indigenous inhabitants, peaceful in nature and small in number, disappeared from their homes along the Eastern Branch within 60 years after they were discovered by Captain John Smith. Some fell to European diseases from which they had no immunity. Some were killed by other warlike tribes, as well as whites, and others migrated west or north. Anacostia itself was incorporated as Uniontown in 1854 and became Washington's first working-class suburb, settled by white workmen from the Navy Yard. African Americans were excluded until the 1880s. Next to Uniontown was Barry Farms. Barry Farms was one of the first early Black housing projects of the Freedmen's Bureau, a U.S. federal government agency that aided freed slaves during the Reconstruction era of the United States. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, who later became known as Frederick Douglass, was born a slave in Talbot County, Maryland. The exact date of Douglas's birth is unknown. He chose to celebrate it on February 14th. The exact year is also unknown. While he was not native to this area, his contributions warrant mention. Frederick Douglass was an African-American social reformer, orator, writer, and statesman. After escaping from slavery, he became a leader in the abolitionist movement, gaining a reputation for his dazzling oratory and anti-slavery writings. He stood as a living counterexample to slaveholders' arguments that slaves did not have the intellectual capacity to function as independent American citizens. Many Northerners also found it hard to believe that such a great orator had been a slave. Frederick Douglass wrote of the sailing ships he saw daily during his boyhood slavery along the Chesapeake Bay. He is quoted as having said, "Those beautiful vessels robed in white, and so delightful to the eyes of freemen, were to me so many shrouded ghosts." Douglass contrasted the ships, loosed from their moorings and free, with his own condition, fastened my chains and a slave. And he swore, "This very bay shall yet bear me into freedom." As a skilled but still enslaved ship caulker in Baltimore, Douglass worked shoulder to shoulder with black and white sailors and, in his own words, knew a ship from stem to stern and from keelson to crosstrees, and could talk sailor like an old salt. No stranger to waterfront tales of hardship, brutality, and deprivation at sea, he nonetheless persisted in his metaphorical view of ships as freedom's swift-winged angels, because, unlike the white men who spoke movingly of the slavery aboard ship, he knew real slavery firsthand. As it turned out, Frederick Douglass employed a seafaring subterfuge instead of a ship to escape his chains. On May 28, 1796, an act for the protection and relief of American seamen was passed by Congress. This act provided certificates for sailors as proof of their United States citizenship and was intended to help protect American sailors from the British practice of impressment or the seizing of seamen for service in the Royal Navy. So in September of 1838, disguising himself as a sailor by dressing in a red shirt and tarpaulin hat and a black scarf tied in sailor fashion, he borrowed a seaman's protection certificate from a black sailor and left for Philadelphia by train. He succeeded because free black seamen were then so common as to draw a few second looks. In 1877, Frederick Douglass bought his family's final home in Washington, D.C., on a hill above the Anacostia River in what is now known as Anacostia. He and his wife Anna named it Cedar Hill. They expanded the house from 14 to 21 rooms. 1 year later, Douglass purchased adjoining lots and expanded the property to 15 acres. Anna died in 1882, and in 1884, Douglass married again to Helen Pitts, a white suffragist and abolitionist from Honeo, New York. Douglass responded to criticisms of his second marriage by saying that his first wife had been someone the color of his mother, and his second, someone the color of his father. The home is now preserved as the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site and is open to the public. On to our next site, Abington Plantation. Abington Plantation was the birthplace of Nellie Custis Lewis, the adopted granddaughter of George Washington, and used to occupy most of the land that is now Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. The ruins of the main plantation building are located in the space between two parking garages. During the course of its 190-year history, Abington was owned by members of the Alexander family, for whom Alexandria is named. John Parke Custis, George Washington's adopted stepson, moved his family to Abington in 1778. Through the Custis family, Abington is associated with the families of the Virginia plantations of Mount Vernon, Stratford Hall, Kenmore, Woodlawn, and Arlington. On the various markers placed at the location by the Washington Metropolitan Airports Authority, the lineages of the owning families are displayed, but there is no mention if slaves lived there or not. But we have to assume that slaves were part of this plantation. The owner at the time of the Civil War served in the Confederate Army, although the Union occupied Alexandria and used it as a base to take in slaves escaping from the South. Alexandria was one of the farthest points north in the American slave trade prior to the Civil War. Abington burned to the ground in 1930. 8 years later, the land was chosen as the site of National Airport. Time once again to move on to our next and final site, Alexandria, Virginia. The first settlement was established in 1695 in what was then the English colony of Virginia. Its comprehensive tobacco inspection law of 1730 mandated that all tobacco grown in the colony must be brought to locally designated public warehouses for inspection before sale. One of the sites designated for a warehouse on the upper Potomac River was at the mouth of Hunting Creek. However, the ground was unstable at that location, and the warehouse was established a half-mile north of where the water ran deep to the shore. In 1791, Alexandria was included in the area chosen by George Washington to become the District of Columbia. A portion of the city of Alexandria, known as Old Town, and all of today's Arlington County share the distinction of having been originally in Virginia, made part of the District of Columbia, and later given back to Virginia by the federal government in 1846. When the district was reduced in size, it excluded that portion of the district south of the Potomac River. The city of Alexandria was rechartered in 1852. From 1828 to 1836, Alexandria was home to the Franklin and Armfield slave market, one of the largest slave trading companies in the country. By the 1830s, they were sending more than 1,000 slaves annually from Alexandria to the Natchez, Mississippi, and New Orleans markets to help meet the demand for slaves in Mississippi and surrounding states. Later owned by Price, Birch and Company, the slave pens became a jail under Union occupation. While not visible directly from the water, there are approximately 23 African-American sites located in Alexandria and 11 original African-American neighborhoods. The neighborhoods shown in the map are the Bottoms, Haiti, Uptown, the Berg and Fish Town, the Hump, Cross Canal, the Hill, Colored Rosemont, Southside, and finally, Mudtown and Fort Ward African American Community Cemetery. The city of Alexandria became independent of Alexandria County in 1870. The remaining portion of Alexandria County changed its name to Arlington County in 1920. As our tour draws to a close, I would like to introduce you to Lewis Jefferson. As early as 1854, African American churches chartered boats for excursions down the Potomac River. The river seemed to provide the perfect refuge from the harsh racial atmosphere of the times. With its meandering, undeveloped shoreline and sheltered coves, the Potomac allowed Black patrons to relax relatively unmolested, with little fear of white harassment. By the 1890s, the city's working-class Black population had grown large enough to become a noticeable presence in city life and riverside recreation. Black clubs and organizations grew and thrived as they protected their members from the dangers of a volatile economy through mutual aid. They also offered newcomers an outlet for fellowship in a strange and hostile urban environment. By 1894, African Americans were active in the commercial river trade on the Potomac River in the Washington, D.C. area as owners and operators of steamships and riverboats. The 210-foot sidewheeler Lady of the Lake seen here was owned and operated by the People's Transportation Company. She was used for passenger freight traffic with terminals at Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and Norfolk. The National Steamboat Company was formed in 1895 and operated the 236-foot sidewheeler George Leary for excursions. The owners were William H. Thomas, Austin Fickling, Daniel Williams, John C. Norwood, Harrison Gordon, and Merritt Williams. Unfortunately, I was not able to obtain any photographs of these gentlemen. In 1896, the People's Excursion Company was created and operated the 160-foot sidewheeler Kent for short excursions downriver. By age 35, Lewis Jefferson became one of Washington, D.C.'s first Black millionaires. His enterprises included fertilizer, general contracting, real estate development, and shipbuilding. In 1898, one of Lewis Jefferson's companies, the Independent Steamboat and Barge Company, acquired President Lincoln's favorite boat, the 181-foot sidewheeler River Queen. It was later replaced with a vessel called the Angler. The River Queen was still operating in 1910. At the time, she was among the oldest sidewheelers still in service. However, in July 1911, newspapers reported that the River Queen was destroyed by fire following an onboard explosion. In the early 1900s, Lewis Jefferson assumed management of and developed several riverside resorts on the Potomac River. Notley Hall, later renamed Washington Park, and Riverview were both located in Prince George's County, Maryland, and were serviced by his riverboats. Notley Hall was located in Fort Washington, Maryland, less than 1 mile south of National Harbor. Riverview is also located in Fort Washington, Maryland, right off of what is now Hatton Point Road. This slide shows the route downriver from Washington, D.C. to the resorts. The original dance hall at Riverview can be seen from the river today. It has been converted to a private house. In 1904, Jefferson purchased the Jane Moseley, a 200-foot long, 35-foot wide sidewheeler and the following summer began advertising it as the only first-class excursion boat owned by an African American. Now, this concludes our virtual tour of Moments in Black History on the Potomac River. And as we head back to our dock at the wharf, I'll attempt to answer any questions you all may have. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. That was terrific. Yeah, there have been quite a few questions, and we'll start answering those. If you do have a question, feel free to type it in the chat or the Q&A, or if you're watching on Facebook, you can type it in the comments. So can you tell us a little bit about the cruises that you do? You mentioned this one was like a 3-hour type cruise. Like, how far of a distance would it go? And can you tell us anything else about it? I know you and I had a discussion before about eating crabs on the cruise.
Yeah, there are a couple of options that we have, that the company has. Let me put it that way. This tour that I do is 3 hours, and it runs basically from the wharf, or the southwest waterfront in DC, all the way down past Alexandria, almost to that the dance hall that I showed you. Depending on the weather, and if we leave on time, we can get that far. I can't tell you what the distance is. I just don't. I just know that we go 3 hours. I'd have to plot it out to figure out what the distance is. That's one option. We also go up the Anacostia, where I showed you on those little maps. That's the route that I take when I do the tour. The second thing that we do is what we call the crab boat. This is what you and I talked about. This is all you can eat crabs that we get from Captain White's, again, down at the wharf. A lot of sides and crabs, and it's a 3-hour tour. We go wherever the client really wants to go, because that's not an open boat. It is generally chartered to groups. We do birthday parties, we do anniversaries, we do company outings, and they want to do the crab boat. Wherever they want to go within the 3-hour limit, we'll do that. If they want to buy more time, we'll do that too. But in my experience, after 3 hours, people get a little antsy and they want to get back on shore. Then we have regular cruises that people, if you want to do a birthday party, bring your own food and just go out for 2-3 hours, we can accommodate that as well.
So my plan is to sign up for both.
Okay.
Let's see, this wasn't a question, it was a comment from Alexis. Well, it's a half question, half comment. She says, is this presentation from a book authored by the speaker? If not, I would encourage him to write one. This information is invaluable. It can be hard to find from a single source. So have you written your book on this topic yet, or is it a work in progress?
It's actually a work in process. The material was gathered from multiple sources. As I said in the beginning, the actual tour takes 3 hours. I wasn't timing this time, so I'm not sure how long this one took. I have a very keen interest in history, and I am working actually on another one. It's a little different. It's global in nature as opposed to just DC.
Yeah, tell us about that if you don't mind.
Sure. It's called Black Mariners, down through history, then and now, all the way from the ancient African mariners, sailors, that actually, a lot of people don't believe this, but you really have to take a look at it. Arrived in the Americas 3,000 years before Columbus. There's evidence all up and down the eastern seaboard of where the Africans made landfall. So I covered the history of Africans, Africans, and then African Americans, then Blacks on the high seas, as well as contemporary sailors and mariners. And that is a work in progress. It's probably going to be at least as long, if not longer, than this presentation.
You know when you'll be done with that?
I'm sorry?
You know when you'll be done with that?
Hopefully within about maybe a month or so.
Oh, terrific. Okay, that sounds excellent. Well, we'd love to have you come back and
Okay.
talk about that. And
Sure.
then what about a comment and a question on the Pearl? So the comment was amazing that there hasn't been a Hollywood type film made of that adventure because it was so fascinating. But then the question, the Cornfield Harbor, is there anything there now, like a historical marker? Can people go there and visit it?
It's still a marina. It's actually a marina.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, you can go there. I'm not sure if they have any historic markers there. Rarely will you find markers depicting these sort of events. My wife and I traveled up to Canada, actually Buffalo, New York, Niagara Falls, that area. And they do have historic markers of the Underground Railroad because Harriet Tubman used that area to transport escaped slaves into Canada. But I haven't been to Cornfield Harbor personally, so I really couldn't tell you if there were any markers there. But yes, you can go there by land.
And then let's see, our friend Craig says, could you talk a bit about the British naval raids in the Chesapeake during the War of 1812, designed mainly to liberate slaves and either enlist them in the British Army as colonial Marines or send them to parts of the British Empire? Francis Key objected to these raids in the Star Spangled Banner. So yeah, I think the British kind of came through and were trying to stir up the pot, so to speak, with the enslaved population.
And you will have to wait until my next webinar.
Oh, that's a topic for that one.
That's part of what I'm working on right now.
Okay, that's part
It's not
two.
only the Chesapeake Bay, but also the Great Lakes.
Okay, terrific. And then Julie asked a question: that I hear correctly that Frederick Douglass's name was adopted later in life? Yes, he was initially Frederick Bailey and then changed his name to Frederick Douglass.
Right.
What
I
about
don't know when, but he did change his name.
what about the Potomac River? Are people able to like fish in that water, or is it that not you can't eat the
Oh
stuff
yeah.
that comes out of there? Oh, you can.
No,
Okay.
the Potomac River compared to what it was even since I moved here, and I moved here in 1970, has, I wouldn't say it's completely turned around, but it's so much better. People jet ski, they paddleboard, kayak, these kayaks, a lot of water contact sports take place on the river, even around DC. Fishing is amazing. I have caught rockfish in up near Haynes Point or East Potomac Park, off that area. The Washington, the Potomac River in this area was part of the American Bass Fishermen's Tournament on that circuit. So yeah, fishing is good, and you can eat them. Catfish don't have 3 heads, maybe 5 eyes, but not 3 heads.
Let's see. It looks like you already have some advanced orders for your book, FYI. And then a couple people, I'm kind of lumping a bunch of questions together. A few people asked, what's the name of like, how would someone find out about the tours, the boat tours when they start up again? And is there a name of this company that
Yeah, the company is called Capital River Cruises. And there is a website, capitalrivercruises.com. And you get the information through there. Just tell them I sent you. I'm one of their senior captains. I generally do all the charters. There is another part of the company that does 45-minute tours. We leave out of Georgetown and head downriver towards National Airport, which takes us under the 14th Street bridges. Sometimes we'll go into the that little cove by the Pentagon. But generally speaking, we'll go down near the National Airport, turn around, and come back. And the trip takes 45 minutes.
And then
that is a walk-on. Anybody can go on there.
And then for those of you listening, you might know that I joke around a lot. I wasn't joking when I said I want to be the first person on the cruise when the things start back up again. So we'll do that at some point in time. And
I will let you know.
Yeah, and I'll be happy to email that out to everyone that signed up today, just because I'm guessing a lot of you would like to do that as well. So just FYI, so we won't forget about you in that. Let's see, Gloria asked a question. There were African-American headstones on CBS Sunday Morning that were found on the Potomac River by some residents in their backyard. Do you know where this is located at on the Potomac? I didn't hear that, but that sounds interesting.
I saw that segment, and I'm sorry I didn't make note of where it was. They were used as riprap. I'm not sure whether it was Potomac River itself or it was on the bay someplace, but they were torn up from a cemetery to make way for some kind of development or highway or something like that. It's probably, I would say you may be able to go online of CBS and do some research there, see if they have this segment.
And then Susan asked, is there a history of slaves being brought to Washington with their owners? So I can answer the first part of that. Yes, that was actually quite common. There was a hotel that was by where the museum used to stand, if you know where that was. And they actually had down in the basement like a slave jail where they would lock people up. And I've seen advertisements for that establishment. And they basically guaranteed that if your slave escaped while you were staying at their hotel in this jail area, that they would fully reimburse you for it. Is kind of like an inducement to get people to come stay there. But so yeah, that was somewhat common for people to do. Bill, I don't know if you have any other information on that.
No, I don't. I know what you're talking about, but I don't have any more information. I could sort of as a historical reference type thing, watch 12 Years a Slave, because initially a lot of it takes place in DC and Alexandria.
Yeah, Washington DC, right? Exactly. Let's see. Let's take a minute to go through these. Oh, so how did you get started in the captaining business? Was it like a hobby, or were you in the military, or how did your family?
Yes, yes, and yes.
Okay.
I started out a long time ago, and I'll just come out and say I'm 70 plus years old. Okay. I started out, learned how to sail when I was about 12 years old, maybe. I'm from New York originally. Spent my summers in Sag Harbor, Long Island, which is out near the Hamptons. That was at a time when there was no worries about people snatching you off the streets or litigating or worrying something would happen. Walking along the beach with a bunch of friends, and we found a sunfish. If you all know what that is, it's almost like a sailboat, like a surfboard with a sail. And we found out who owned it and took it out, and I self-taught as far as sailing is concerned. That's when I got bit by the bug. I didn't purchase my first boat until I moved to DC and after I got married, which was in 1970. I've owned several boats since then. I was military. I was an Army veteran. Ironically, I should have enlisted in the Navy, but I'm a Vietnam era Army vet. But I have owned several boats of my own, about 3. One was a commercial towing operation where I was one of the guys that if your boat broke down on the river, I would come out and get you. I would either tow you in, I would deliver fuel, I would jumpstart you. I didn't do any repairs. Ironically, this baby here, along with a sister ship, I towed when I had the towing operation. Then I wound up working for the guy, for the owner. When I retired from DC government, I got rid of the towing operation. I had my captain's license already. So I've had my captain's license for over 20 something years. I've been on the river for 40 something years. It's just something that I like. Started out basically as a hobby, as a recreational boater, and then turned into a profession, which I still enjoy to this day. They say if you enjoy something that you do, you don't, it's not a job.
So let's see. So one thing that's really neat about doing these programs is people chime in with stuff that they know. And so quite a few people were talking about the CBS segment, and Jay actually posted the link. So I put it in the chat and on the Facebook comment section for everyone. So thanks, Jay, and everyone else who chimed in. Appreciate that. Let's see. Here was a question from Heidi, and she's watching us on Facebook. Did Tangier or Smith Islands have a place in this history at all on the bay? She asked that a little bit earlier.
That I could not ask. I could not answer because I did not research too much on the bay itself. I concentrated primarily on the river. The information that I gave in the beginning was kind of a prologue of what I was going to talk about. But I know what you're talking about, though, Smith Island, Tangier. I really don't know. Those are kind of little independent clusters. They probably did, but I couldn't swear to it. I'd be nice to look it up to find out.
Okay, no, that's no problem. And then let's see. What about for those that are watching that are either boat owners or interested in owning a boat? You mentioned in the description about the Chesapeake Area Professional Captains Association. Would you mind telling folks a little bit about that organization?
Oh, sure. I love advertising it primarily because I'm the president. CAPCA, as we call it, Chesapeake Area Professional Captains Association. You can look us up on the web, capca.net. We are a membership organization of professional captains. You don't have to be a captain, licensed captain, to attend any of our meetings. You can take advantage of our classes that we give. We have members all the way from Maine to Florida, and some cases in the hills of Tennessee. But I say that only because we've had 2 virtual meetings so far during this period. This past Monday and last month. We get a lot of people, which I was surprised. When we normally met in Annapolis, that's where we're headquartered, where we met at the Elks Lodge, where we got maybe 25 people at every meeting. Monday we had 89 people online, which made me feel really good. And I was able to, like I'm sure you do, Robert, or you can, or have done, I can trace them out, map them out where they logged in from, because I asked them to do that. Let me know where you're from. And we got people from Massachusetts all the way down to Florida. It was nice. It was great. But we provide services to both professional mariners and the general public in terms of community service and education.
So I posted the link for anyone that's interested, along with Bill's contact information in the chat. And then I also posted on Facebook. And then our friend Craig Howell, who he's a history expert, he says Tangier Island was the main British naval base during the War of 1812. The colonial Marines were trained there. So thanks, Craig.
Okay.
I appreciate that. What about, do the cruises take place all year? I imagine there's some days, particularly in the winter, where it's just too cold or icy to go out.
No, it's we have downtime. A lot of it, some of it's mandated by the Coast Guard. A lot of it is cold weather. These boats, as you can see in the back here, they are open. Those are side curtains that we can let down, but there's no air conditioning and there's no heat. So in the summertime when it's hot, you get a really nice breeze when we're underway. So we're not concerned about that. But it's too cold to take these guys out in the wintertime. So there is some downtime. We'll operate in normal times, we would operate through what they call Indian summer. Because if it gets like really warm in September, October, we'll still go out. Probably not on a regular basis in terms of the tours, but if somebody wanted to charter the boat to go out, we would do that. And then start up. Normal startup was around Cherry Blossom Festival time. I don't know whether we'll do that this year or not.
And then this is a comment from Barbara. She says the White House Historical Association has lots of information, videos, research, etc., on slavery in DC. So thanks, Barbara. Appreciate that. So yeah, I went to a presentation a couple years ago at the White House Historical Association, and they were saying that they actually hadn't really studied that topic all that much. But when Michelle Obama gave her famous speech, "The House Built by Slaves," it kind of spurred a lot of questions from the media and people contacting them. And so they had this whole big effort to research that topic more. So that was interesting. So thanks, Barbara, for sharing that. So again, Barbara wanted to let us know the White House Historical Association has lots of information, videos, research, etc., on slavery in Washington, D.C. So thank you. Let's see. A couple people pointed out, someone wrote, "Looking good for 70s." Maybe
Thank
it's
you.
the water. Out in the water is good for you.
Yeah, when you're being out here with the sun and the spray and the mist and everything. Thank you.
You're still getting more requests for your book. What about, do you know how deep the Potomac River is at its deepest point?
Actually, both the Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac River are very shallow, relatively speaking. Although there are some pockets in the river that may be approaching 60 something feet deep, the average depth is only about 30, 40 feet. It's so shallow, it prevented Henry Hudson from coming up the river with his ship. And that's why we now have the Hudson River in New York, and Potomac is Potomac and not the Hudson River here. It was too deep for those very deep draft sailing ships to make it up this far.
Someone asked, maybe you're going to talk about this at your next presentation. Do you have any information on the Black history of the upper portions of the Anacostia near Bladensburg? Is it similar to the lower Anacostia? And then someone just basically asked what your thoughts were about Annapolis.
Ah,
Well, good seafood in Annapolis and lots of cool stuff to see there.
yeah.
Annapolis has there's a memorial to Kunta Kinte because supposedly in the Alex Haley book, that's where he came ashore. So if you haven't been there, they have a lot of things related to Black history and the Underground Railroad. The State House just earlier, or this last spring, I think, unveiled statues of Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. So there's a lot of cool things to see in Annapolis. But anything you want to share, Bill?
Yeah, the one thing to keep in mind, what I was working on was localized. So Annapolis wouldn't be local for me for this area. Bladensburg, I thought about it, but I couldn't find a whole lot of information. I know there's a Battle of Bladensburg. Again, it's one of those things. It was outside of the tour that I normally do, so I didn't go there, so to speak, and I don't cover it in the next go round because I concentrate on the people that are actually out there, seafarers that make the boats work, as opposed to sights and sounds and events on shore or near shore, or maybe even on the river itself. And again, it's the next one is more global in scale. You know, I cover African American mariners at war, fighting America's conflicts. Some groundbreakers, things like that. But yeah, I know a little bit, enough to be dangerous about Bladensburg. But no, I don't know that much about it. The one thing that the little interesting fact that some people know, I'm sure a lot of you that are watching do, but some people don't. We have two nearby forts that flank the Potomac River just south of DC. One is Fort Washington in Maryland. One is Fort Hunt in Virginia, and they're right across the river from each other. The idea was to flank the river to prevent the British from sailing up the river to DC. They would essentially blow them out of the water. But the British came overland. And I don't think Fort Washington ever fired a shot.
Yeah, there's so many things in history where they they have this great plan, and then things end up turning out differently than what they expected to take place.
Right, right.
Someone, I can answer this question. Someone asked if you know the name of the person who stole the ship during the Civil War in Charleston. There's actually two people asked that question. Yeah. That was Robert Smalls.
Robert Smalls, yes.
Planter. So perhaps maybe you're going to talk more about that next time. Sarah asked a question: is there information available about any African-American steamboat captains, owners? I have found two, and what you know, their names have escaped me right now.
Steamboat owner, well, Lewis Jefferson was one of them. He owned those, you know, the part of the latter part of the presentation. So he had several steamboats, side wheelers, operating on the Potomac.
Yeah, that was a question from earlier because I didn't see that earlier. So
okay, okay. And there was also, well, it wasn't steamboats, but contemporary wise, there was a group that operated for about 10 years and I worked for, and I was their senior captain. And they were the first Black owned and operated charter boat operators since Lewis Jefferson. But it's been a number of years now that since the business stopped operating.
So let's see, why don't we wrap things up? So what I'll do is I'll email the folks in a few months when we start doing the in-person boat tours, because I just think that would be really awesome. And then when you finish your other presentation, let us know and I'll email the folks and tell them about that as well, because there's a lot of people saying that they want to come to part 2.
Okay. Well, what I'll do, like I did with this one, I'll do when I get close to getting it scripted, I'll do a preview.
Okay.
And like I did with this one, and I'll let you know.
Okay, perfect. And then, of course, if a few years from now, if you finish that book, you'll have to let us know that as well.
Okay. Karan Demars I kept seeing that hand being raised. Do you see it?
I just saw that as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So if you have a question, it's better if you have a question to put it in the chat or the Q&A as opposed to raise your hand, because we have too many people to like call on people that raise their hands, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, well, I think that wraps it up. So we'll call it an evening. Thanks so much, Captain Bill. That was awesome. And we did record this program. Hopefully, good. If all goes well, I'll post it on our Facebook and YouTube pages, and I can email it to the link to all of you as well when we're done. And like I said, I'm looking forward to going on the cruise with you and checking this stuff out in person. I feel like this was a good preview for the in-person one, and because we recorded, people could actually listen to it again before they go on the real in-person cruise at some point in time.
Great.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. Happy Friday. We'll see you again soon. Take care. Enjoy your weekend.
Everybody be safe.